have to not care when you roll this.
So area denied. Defend 5.
That's the hurt.
And
All right, hey, what's up, everyone? We're coming back here again a couple weeks later, getting ready to finish up Celestine the Living Stink. We broke her up into 3 different spots last time, and we were working on her base with the cloak and birds, separate from her body on here and her set of wings. Primed them up in a bunch of different spots, so we're going to go ahead and get going on this one. Probably work for about an hour 45, see if we can get her done this time and call it a day. So before we got started, I went ahead and covered her base in Menagerie standard gray to get that drying so we can start putting a wash over it. That type of stuff usually takes a little longer to dry. And then, you know, really however you want your army to go. She's going alongside the rest of my Blood Angels to see if she can put a little bit of hurt that way. So I made a list of the way we're going to go through this. Get the base drying, work on the tapestry here, finish up her wings, do face and hands on her hair afterwards, after we get all the details done inside of her face. That way kind of work out inside out, and then finish up her sword and the different flowers and kind of white details around that. So we're going to go ahead and dive right in with the different purity seals and stuff that hang off her base and keep her attached. Kind of get a bigger brush going. Again, working over with that wet palette, had a lot of paint. This is actually paint that I had from last time, from even like 2 weeks ago, and we're still rocking and rolling with that. So we can work right off of the palette that we have here. Thin down some Rackar flesh. You can really get this to any consistency, really thin it down nice, and we'll still get really good coverage. So what we're going to do is kind of look at how this dries after we're done with it, and maybe have to do a second coat worth. I have my doubts. And let that dry and come back over it with some Agrax Earth Shade, really shade that down, and then depending on what your taste is in these things, if you want them really kind of grungy and shaded, just stop right there and highlight in something like Screaming Skull or a white to get the highlight on these things. Or you can do another dry brush of Rackar flesh over top of the highest recesses, and then once again with something like Screaming Skull. Yeah, I know, we're in a game store, so I have the door closed. There's some people kind of playing in the room next door, and try my best to kind of talk over, but just have to excuse the background noise. So. Let's be sure to kind of come back over these edges and whatnot and try to work a little bit fast as we go over the edges, because on these really thin details with sharp edges, it likes to pull up. Sometimes paint kind of builds up on those edges and it might give you some unwanted bumps and whatnot along those. Be really careful when you get close to this cloak. This was an area that we were going to try to avoid last time, that way we don't have to come back and paint over it. Really took care of that in the spray phase, and we're going to go back through later on and hit those recesses with a really thin down shade to just kind of give it a shaded white look. But I really don't want to have to do too much to that area, because I already like how clean it came out. kind of take some care with this around the edge of the base where we have the detail built up. After we're done here, I really liked the detail that the Games Workshop version of this had, where it had all the different kind of text on it, and then some various kind of icons and symbols going down it. Hopefully get the opportunity to really carry that over into some of the new models coming out in their range next year. Hopefully, fingers crossed that that's actually going to be coming out here. I don't know if anyone else is super excited about the prospect of some new Sisters of Battle, but that's going to be an instant purchase for me. Almost done with these.
Brad, nice to meet you. Yep. Back out. Get into a building and shoot. It's so good. No, it's just you can apply all that. Oh yeah. That's 3 turns and that was 2 hours. Oh, you were solid.
Probably one more time through here will do it. Cover up the areas where I kind of got the edges of this when I was putting some gray down on the base. We're using a pretty thick brush there, and kind of just drifting over onto some other pieces that are in contact with it. It's just going to happen. Just, you know, be careful where we identify that we don't want to hit it again, but for these types of things and paint that covers this easily, it's pretty easy. Asking if I ever airbrush stuff. I really want to. I really want to try an airbrush sometime. I don't have one, and I feel like that would be something that would be kind of neat. For now, you know, just kind of go through a little bit more of a painstaking process to try to get stuff to that airbrush quality while using brushes with different washes and really kind of tight layering between colors that are pretty close to each other, and spend more time working up those shades like we did on the back of this cloak here. But I definitely want to try to get an airbrush and learn how to do that. I feel like it would make vehicles really cool. Smaller stuff like this, I'm not so sure. These little single type things, and especially when we're working on something this small, I don't really know how I would apply airbrush to that, but that's just kind of where I'm at with that now. So it's still drying a little bit in the areas between the base. You can tell, you can kind of rub it off here with our fingers. Going to come back through once that dries more with some Nuln oil and earth shade on this. Let that dry, and then kind of dry brush everything and get kind of a decent shade on there. Largely this part's done with the birds and the cloak. I do want to do some freehand line work with that kind of Sisters of Battle looking scroll, maybe a couple like fleur type designs here, which we'll circle back around and do. So I'm going to move on to the wings. We left off before here. I painted all the gold and came back through with some Reichland flesh shade over top of the gold. Hey buddy, how you doing? Son says hi. So I'm going to grab the finest point brush that I have, basically one that can really hold a fine tip, to work into the area between her wings. I want to get a little bit of a shade, but not too much, not too dark. So I'll probably go with some Drakenhof Nightshade, Gilman Blue Glaze, blend the two together, toss a little bit of Lamia Medium in it to kind of improve the flow there, and then go right between those one coat. I don't really want to have to go over the white paint again on that one, just because it's such a flat area and really high chance of messing it up and undoing all the work that I've already done on it.
John Marshall. Oh, Lexington. Oh, so you play with Matt Williams. Matt Williams, Alan Kong.
So you see here, just mixing the two together in a kind of a darker blue version of the glaze. And then coming back over for some Lamia Medium.
I don't want to get too crazy with it. Long still.
There we go. And now, I know this is really hard to see because we're basically doing details on white, but this area here where you can kind of see some shade between those colors and then this area with nothing, that's where we're already done. So I just want to replicate that on the next side. So if it feels like the brush, and this one might not be working for me here, it already kind of opened up a little bit too far, so I might switch over to a different brush here. Really don't want these to do much. I want it just to keep a nice fine line. And it really is the largest open area on the model. There we go. And just as carefully as you can. Drag away from the outer edge. And shade right up against that armor and into the creases.
I think that right there is a pretty close, solid play to what I think would be good in Michigan. I can see that.
Cards. Chaos.
Death Guard struggles. Mobility.
So we'll get this added in here, and then maybe later on, once this dries up a little bit more, come back through with some really fine white and go over the outer edge here, so we can see so we can kind of clean up some of those lines. But it's a really fine highlight right along that edge, or a shade between those different parts of her wing that really just intended to stay white as it is.
Are you doing Michigan stuff?
No, I'm still learning on
If you were going to do the card.
Sure to keep the paint really thin here. If it's too thick, it really just starts to show up and doesn't really dry into a shade that fills the recess. You see I'm kind of coming back over it right before it dries and wiping off with my finger just the higher areas there, just so that it doesn't really end up drying in areas where I don't intend it to. I really want this to look nice because it's the highest point on the model, It's the largest thing on the model. The rest of her is really not that big. So pretty happy with the outcome of that one, where just to show some separation between all the different wings, or the parts of her wing.
No, I've got that page open up on my tablet. I've not played so long.
Yeah.
Genuinely excited.
There you go, Mike.
Kind of go a little bit heavier right where they all meet, and keep the paint moving
70 or 80
on there, so it doesn't dry in awkward spaces or just areas where you don't want it to. So I'm going to come back over to the other side and just kind of feather a little bit of this color into the edge and shade closer to the armor, just to distinguish the difference between the wings and the armor. Alright, so overall, pretty happy with that. It looks pretty even between the two sides of the wing. So I'm going to come back out now with some silver and take care of these details, take care of the skull, hit these wires up with some red, and keep on moving. Go with a slightly larger brush here, since we're not doing really fine highlights and small edges. Start off with some lead belcher, silver to come back in and hit the vents down here on her backpack, doing our best to avoid all the areas that we've already done in gold, shaded and highlighted those. Kind of working through areas here where the spray got a little bit grainy on me. Gotta love Ohio in the summertime with all this humidity. Put these hoses in here. And finally, our iron halo around the skull. It's easy to tend to work pretty quickly around this area, and again, this is another area where you want to be careful because we just put all that work in on the wings, and I don't want to slip and hit it with silver and then have to go back and work over that again. Things like this just tend to take a little bit more time just because there's lots of little nooks and crannies between all the spikes and the inner edges of it. Doing my best to avoid the skull because it's already white, so if I can get away with that and just have to do some kind of bone colors around it, that's a win in my book. So. So that should take care of that. Let's flip it over and do the other side here. Kind of quickly. Get it? No, Ben, it would definitely not look cool with red wings and armor and hair. I definitely have enough red in my armies already. For those who haven't heard already, I'm dealing with Blood Angels and same Han Eldar and plenty of other armies that are already red, so currently get made fun of for the amount of red that I paint. So hey, if you like it and you get used to painting it, why not? This area here doesn't have to be perfect. It's usually covered up by the area that's between the backpack and her back, but if you're a perfectionist or you just can't sleep at night knowing that part of the mini is unpainted, or if you want to, just make sure to have that perfect one, like interiors of vehicles and stuff, then just come back and hit that. And then the back side of the Iron Halo. Again, this is kind of a tricky area here between the halo and her wings. You can see how much this thing moves on us too, since the designers were kind enough to only attach this thing by this tiny little cord right there. So can't wait for this to potentially be the first thing to break off this model if it fell over weird or something. It seems that as we go along here, these models get more and more fragile with every release, especially in Age of Sigmar. I don't know why, but I decided to collect two of the most fragile ones out there between Sylvan F with all their branches that can break off, and I didn't have a Deepkin with all the fish and different pieces of the elven armor that are just begging to snap off every time you pick it up. Just going to spend one extra second here kind of going between the spikes in the Iron Halo just to make sure we get nice and even coverage. Again, being really careful. In the areas that are close to her wings. And I'd say that that's pretty good right there. We can come back in and do some Screaming Skull on the skull and hit that with Agrax Earthshade as you go. So really do our best to think about working through these things in stages and working on one color at a time as we go. So if I've got Agrax Earthshade that I need to put on that skull, and I also have to put it back on the tapestry here coming down, or the purity seals, do it all at once just to make life easier on us. So I'm actually going to do that right now. We're going to, before I go on to Celestine herself, put some Nuln Oil on the base and some Earthshade on the seals in that skull, and Nuln Oil on the silver that we just painted on the backpack to let that sit aside and dry while I move on to the rest of it. Alright, so starting with Nuln Oil. Really good shake, especially when you want to try to shade something down with this stuff. You really want to shake the heck out of it and get all the stuff that settles at the bottom, because that's going to kind of stain the model more. If you're looking to just fill in the recesses, maybe just a light shake just to kind of get it mixed up a little bit. But if you keep it a little bit thinner, it won't stain the surfaces of what you're putting on as much, and will run more so into the recesses. So just one of fun fact, I suppose. So we're going to come back in here really quick, just work some Earthshade around this base, or non-oil, sorry, around the base. I don't want it to be that dark, so just grab some water out of my paint pot, use that to kind of expand it out and spread it further around the base. Kind of want to watch when you get close to this, because I don't really want to be putting any black shade on the purity seals, or whatever we're calling them now. I'm sure I'll call it something else in 10 minutes when I circle back around to paint it again. Probably put this model in the top 3 or 4 of the most unstable models that I've painted in a long time, where it only attaches with this one little point here and constantly moves. Same thing happened with the Mortarks for the Undead Army, for Legion and Nagash, but I ended up changing the base around so they're holding on to something, and it actually restabilizes the model. But I really liked the look of her floating, kind of, and only attached by these 2 seals here. So I kept it that way. I figured we'll just deal with it moving around. That's another reason why we didn't glue it together, because we're trying to paint her while she's attached to this, and it's constantly moving. So be sure to just kind of wipe off the edges if you're just holding onto this. Get some thumbprints on the side, and we'll go back around the base. I usually use Warnfang Brown. Someone's calling them CVS receipts that's holding her up. It's pretty accurate. Every time I get one of those things, they're about 15 miles long. Before I put the non-oil away, the silver area that we just did on there, not much of it, so it should be dry already. If it isn't, maybe it mixes in a little bit, but you're never going to notice the difference here. So I'm going to come back in, do the areas here where we painted all that kind of hose silver, the underside of the skull where the silver parts are, and the iron halo. I've said it a couple times now, but again with this one, extra careful when you're shading this one, because this thing likes to snap around a lot, and it could splash some non-oil on your wings, and you get some spots over there. Come back into the back side here of this. And there we go. It kind of gave some really good definition to the silver area. And around here, if you want, where the areas where the wings attach to the backpack, to kind of just show, to separate it a little bit more, you can lightly get that brush in there. It depends on what type of brushes you like to use. I like these ones where they keep a nice tip and they're pretty wide, so you can do some bigger areas with them, but you can also really twist it down to a nice fine point and do some pretty detailed areas with it. So I'm going to set that aside, let it dry. switch over to our Agrax Earthshade. Come back over here and work on our tapestry / purity seal / CVS receipts. Keeping the holder up here. Again, be sure to really get to not neglect the edges of this. It'll really show up if you paint these parts, but not this outer edge here. Go along the ground. At this point here, not really going to matter if you get over into if it runs off of there on the base. The base is going to try to kind of grab a little paint, a little bit of the wash off your brush, and that's okay. It's going to pull up on us a little bit here, which is fine because we're going to come back through with a dry brush and really clean that up, and make those things, we really want to make it try to look like it's made out of fabric. So we'll get a nice smooth transition there, and then it'll also be broken up by the different kind of writing and inscriptions that we put all over it later on. So once we're all done with this one today, I'll probably put up a message in the chat here on Facebook, see what model to paint next, maybe in a month or so. I was kind of going between the Armiger Helvrin, the new small little baby Imperial Knight. Have that, can do some stuff for Age of Sigmar, from like Stormcast, like Estrella Soulbright, or the Kellian Leviathan, the big giant turtle for Idoneth Deepkin. Thought that might be fun. I have one of those at home that's unpainted, and that would definitely be a challenging project. Maybe post up 3 or 4 different models, and whichever one gets kind of a good reception, paint that one next. Only concerns for something like the Leviathan might be the size of the space that we're working with here and the amount of time that we have to paint. Those types of models take many hours sometimes, given their size, and trying to really find something that we can get done in 2 or 3 2-hour sessions or so. Alright, so we have the wings drying, we have the lower half of her cloak drying. Also didn't want to neglect this small purity seal. I just noticed it as I set this back here. It's right here where the birds attach, so I'm going to go ahead and paint that Rakarth flesh just like the back part here, being careful around their tails because we already came through and did that white and blue. Let that dry. When we have some Agrax Earthshade later, we'll come back over and hit that again. Alright, so right now I'm going to start working on Celestine. Do her face and her hands, the skin that we have to do here, so we can then do her hair, which, once I start working on her hair, I don't want to have to paint anything left on her face. I like the look that they gave in off the example model where her eyes are all the way white all the way through with kind of a blue glow effect. So I'll show you how to do that once we get to that point. In the last stream we already painted her face with Rakarth flesh just to get the base tone of her face set. I'll go through a couple different ways to do some faces. I know that it can be a little bit of a tricky part where you have a lot of really shallow details on faces. Not unlike the Space Marines doing their faces and stuff like that. They're a little bit easier because the details are a little bit deeper on their faces, and you're not working with something so fine like this. Also, with those ones, if I really screw up really bad on those, I can either pop it off of the model and respray it, or work on it again. Especially with Marines and stuff like that, where their faces and details are so replaceable. But this is a one-time shot for her face. So, all right. So we're going to start with Cadian Flesh Tone. It's a little bit darker. It's a lot warmer of a color, and then we're going to be shading up from that. I don't want her to be super tan. It's kind of a odd look. Her skin was fairly fair in that one, so we're going to be working from Cadian Flesh Tone because it covers really well, all the way up to Pallid Witch Flesh, and then mix a little bit of Pallid Witch Flesh with some Reikland Flesh Shade to tone it down a little bit warmer and not be kind of that so pale that it's like a dead skin almost. Thanks. And we'll go through. So this is really going to make her skin really tan, so it's obviously not a stopping point, and you want to keep it really thin because there's some really nice shallow details here that I don't want to get rid of. Do my best to kind of keep it on screen and focus the really small areas that we're working on. I've already come through and done all the detail on her armor, so a lot like her wings. This model is just a really, really good example of like focused area painting and not really trying to spread over into other areas that we've already painted and just create more work. Now, once I get her hands, her skin painted, you can take a look at the model here and do like a little bit of a mix down of Rhinox hide. It's a dark brown, mix that with water and get it really thin, and then try to paint that between areas. So like, let's say like right here between her hand and her armor, there are two areas that would be finished, but the two tones are really close, and just you can kind of paint a fine line between those areas to break up those two different areas and kind of separate it, and it stops different colors of the model from really washing together, and you can kind of separate out your spaces. I think it looks nice when you're done in the end. So we have those areas done. Gonna get in here and do the face. Really not gonna see much in here other than some flesh tone. Now I have it thinned down and it's really sticking to just the recesses now and not shading out the rest of her face, so that's kind of telling me it's too thin. I need to add just a little bit more in there because I still want coverage out of this paint. So the Cadian Flesh Tone thinned down over top of Radkarth Flesh. When you look at the two paints on their own, you really wouldn't think that you would get this effect, but it fills in pretty nicely, and it doesn't give you that super dark, color that this one already has. That tan type of tone that you're going to get from Cadian Flesh Tone. If you put that right over top of white, you can cover it a little bit well over black, but that's going to come out a lot darker unless you put it over top of a warmer base like Radkarth Flesh. Okay, so that's done. I don't want to have to try to stop and do something else between working on her face, so I'm going to mute for one quick second, hit her face with a hair dryer, and come right back. Alright, so now that we have that done, I'm going to grab the pallid witch flesh, and on my palette here I have some Cadian flesh tone right there. I'm going to take pallid witch flesh and put it on my palette right next to the Cadian flesh tone. Wipe off my brush, grab some Cadian flesh tone, grab some pallid witch flesh, and blend it in between there. Previous time we were kind of talking about the wet palette, how much the advantages that you can get between it, where, you know, I've had this on here for, 10 minutes now or so, and now I can create a mid-tone between the two. There might be a color out there for it, there probably is, between the bajillion paints in the range and across other different makers, Vallejo or whatever. There's a ton of different colors out there, but instead of having to own every color known to man, just making it. So we're going to go over everything again with this one, more so the raised details, kind of avoiding the upper areas here, really focusing on the thumbs and kind of her knuckle, the top part of her hand. Just do a single line over to her knuckles, and again in there like that. There are obviously way quicker ways to do skin tone out there. If I have a big batch of stuff that I have to paint and they have lots of skin, shout out to the Slayer players out there. I'm actually avoiding the army because that would just be so much skin to paint. You could probably get away with doing like a single flesh tone across it and then hitting it with a wash, letting it shade those recesses in, and then going back through. But I like layering this up and getting a nice detail on it, especially on such a centerpiece model for an army, or one that's going to get a lot of attention when you put it on the board. Whether your opponents like it that she's on the board or not, it's going to catch some attention. So do that extra detail, take the extra time to go through here, get some on there, so you can see already on her sword hand that the details are starting to come through. It'll show up a little bit better on her face. And then when we're done here today, I'll post up a picture, more of a light box picture of her in the chat to get a better idea of what's going on, instead of kind of the focal distance of the camera that we have here. Come in here, focus on her cheeks, her nose, bring that highlight down to her chin and her jawline. I found it makes a difference between what different parts of the models that on their faces and stuff, what you highlight. If you put too many highlights on the cheeks and the sides and really hard, bright highlights on the jawline, it makes them look a lot older. To really try to accentuate kind of the structure of their face. So now that's starting to come out a little bit better of the detail that we're doing on her face. I'm going to let that dry. Maybe switch back over, add a little bit more of the pallid witch flesh to that one to bring it up even lighter. Now we're kind of getting closer towards just a warmed up pallid witch flesh, and then really sticking to just the higher areas. So the areas above her thumb, the inner edge of her palm, her fingertips, come back over her face and do the top of her nose, her upper lip, her lower lip, chin, above her cheek, and her forehead. Gonna get in on the side of her face. Be really careful here because you got the armor coming up around the edges, and that's kind of blocking us. Wouldn't be uncommon to get a lot of the paint on that big armored cowl around her neck. So I might come back afterwards with just some Stormhold Silver and just hit those lines again and kind of bring those back up to that bright metallic where they now have skin tone paint on them. On her sword hand, do her fingernails right here at the edge of that one. Move right up and do her next knuckles. Flip over top part of her thumb. And then the upper part of her hand and her knuckles on the back side of the sword hand. So these areas on her hands probably end up shading manually, just dropping a wash on those, especially one that's really thinned down enough to fill in the recesses of her face. The details on her hands and around her sword are so shallow that it's probably not going to do anything to put a wash down on it, or you put one down and then you probably have to do 3 or 4 layers to actually pretty well right now. So I'm going to grab my Reichland Flesh Shade. Some Lamy and medium. I'm gonna put the medium down first. So I don't want too heavy of a wash, so really I'm just going to put the medium down on the paint palette. Obviously you can't see it really well because it's clear. Shake up the Reichland Flesh Shade. We want something warm, but we don't want a lot of it, so we're just gonna stain essentially the flesh shade there, that color that we want, and it's not going to dry very dark at all. Maybe did a little too much there, so I can add some Lamy medium to the palette right there and then just drag little bits of the flesh shade into it until I get a shade that I want on there. This is one of these things that just kind of comes with getting used to doing it. So I'm still going to put it on her hand over here and let it like sit on the palm and let it pull up on the edges of this one. This is okay to let it pull up because it's so thinned down that it's going to dry really thin. They seem obvious, but and I want to let that pull the wash from her hand back towards her armor and kind of let it come off your brush onto the edge of the armor. Her face, we're just going to go ahead and glob it right in the middle there. You want to let it really dry towards her eyes. We're going to come back around with some white and blue and get her eyes to glow a little bit. So it's okay if that shade kind of gets in there. A little bit too much is in underneath her hair, so I wiped off my brush and just going back through with an empty brush and soaking up a little bit of that wash. Okay, gonna mute one more time. Use the hairdryer to dry up that wash really quick. I don't want to let it sit too long. I'm a big fan of using a hairdryer to speed things up a little bit sometimes. Just because if you have an area where you've targeted it with wash and then you're going to wait for it to run, if you can lightly heat that up and let that stuff dry right to where you already set it, it'll already kind of give you that shade that you want there. Especially with Lamy and medium where you're not, your shade isn't going to dry weird because it's already thickened up a little bit with some acrylic medium. Alright, so now that we've done that, we've already got it shaded back down a little bit, so I'm going to go back through with some pallid witch flesh mixed in with a little bit of the Cadian flesh tone that I have left on the palette. I don't want it too dark, it's just a little bit, just enough to take that cooler color off of the witch flesh. He's always working on a really small area here, so you want to keep spinning your brush through it and establishing a really fine tip on your brush. Sometimes stopping every once in a while. I'll keep a wet paper towel nearby and just kind of spin it on the wet paper towel. So, alright, so we have this area here on her hand where it's shaded down nicely. And now just on the really highest points here, we're going to put some paint, and it's really going to come out almost white. You want to keep the highlights really fine. Less is more on this type of area, especially on areas right here where we're working on her face, on her nose, on her cheek. Forehead. And her chin. Okay. So now I'm gonna try to do just her lower lip. Start off with a little bit of Screamer Pink. It's a pretty dark pink. Again, kind of the standard rule for working on the face is keep everything really thin, barely there. This is going to come out really dark, but we're going to go back over it again with Pink Horror, which is a lot lighter, and then the same flesh tone of the face, just to kind of put a little bit of a difference. You don't want to go all the way around her lips with it. It'll stick out, kind of like a clown, and not really trying to make it like makeup per se. Just want to get that flesh tone of someone's lips. So it's really just her lower lip. It'll look really big at first, just because it's such a small area, and then we can grab some Cadian flesh tone, just regular. We've already worked around a highlight in this area here. Come back through, and yeah, she's falling off. Need to reattach her here soon. And just fix the edge of her lip up to the edge of her mouth. So again, really subtle highlights. I'm gonna grab some of the Golden Blue here, as well as ceramite white to work around her eyes, wherever that went. And then what we were talking about earlier with the Rhinox hide. Gonna get some of that, really water it down, and work it into the area. I want to use that to around her mouth, inside her mouth, to show the difference, to really create kind of a gap between her lower and upper lip. And then underneath her nose, just a small little touch. And then up at her hairline. And again, it's just the smallest of small details here. And a lot of that will get broken up once you do her hair. That's carrying a lot of the different colors and stuff off of her face. And once we're going to do the black hair, and it'll really, really contrast between that and her face. So, get in there really quick. Ceramite white. Really thin the heck out of it. Put that on the smallest brush that we have. And paint her eye. Again, for this one we're going to be doing the glowing eyes. So you just kind of want a small white bead where her eye is. And they're kind of to put a piece of hair in front of her other eye. We're going to get in there, kind of dry brush the white around her eyes to make it glow. And then the blue glaze that we put on there, we'll shade it up a little bit differently. Because I really did get white where I didn't want it around her hair there. I'm going to come back with some flesh tone around the side of her eye there. And a little bit more flesh tone around her face here, above her eye. Okay. So, next, grab some blue glaze. It's going to go around the areas where we painted on her eye. Let that kind of glow a little bit. Let that run into the recess, and then we're going to let it dry pretty good. You'll find what you want to do is put some of the paint down, and then it'll probably pull in there too much because we're kind of going for a pretty subtle glow around her eyes. It'll pull in the recesses too much, and then you can go back through with a drier brush, and then you're just kind of trying to stain the areas around her face. And then we'll come back in with some pallid witch flesh and paint up her cheeks in the center of her eyes again once that dries. Not going to take too long for it to dry though. So now it's already pretty much dry. to the point where you really want to be careful. And use this color to bring skin tone back in near her cheeks to stop, you don't want the blue to run all over her face. Alright, so at that point we have the glowing eye effect finished for her. I'm going to come back and paint the hair. Again, really careful on the hair with putting black paint down around her now that we just spent the better part of a half hour just doing her face. Wouldn't want to undo any of that. Chaos Black does pretty well, or well, Abaddon Black now, Abaddon Black, however you want to say it. But on top of the gold, it may not cover in one coat. Don't try to force it to cover up in one coat. Just take your time and drop your brush. Working it into the recesses around her hair, but not her face. Again, with this part right here, making sure that we're extra careful. These are the two parts of her hair, kind of her bangs that hang down right in front of her eyes and all the area that we just went around on. We'll come back through here with some Eshin Gray, and then Mechanicus Standard Gray, and then Dawnstone on her black hair to highlight that up. Black's another one of those colors that just, a little bit of extra detail, kind of adding in that extra layer, the extra color of gray, some step in between the shades, really goes a long way to getting a more realistic highlight on an area that's more of an absence of color. With those, really just picking out kind of the raised areas on her hair that they already provided us to work that gray around. So it's just about done, just working through these small little areas behind her head. That'll mostly get covered up with her wings. But yeah, so now that the hair's been painted in, that actually provides a pretty nice contrast between the hair and her face. Really didn't notice it before. It was kind of hard to tell when that was just gold, and then we did the skin tone for her face. So I might come back through here again just kind of clean up some of the highlights between that one. Puts a little bit more of a thin blue highlight between her eyes and her cheeks with that blue to really give a more realistic glow instead of just hard highlights where those already are. But overall, I'm pretty happy with that. So, really quick, now that the wings are dry, I'm going to grab some Stormhill Silver. Get the highlights done on this. That way we don't need to worry about it later. And I want parts of of her that we've already painted around her hair and stuff to dry so that I can go back and work on those.
I think everybody caught up to you, man.
Nice bright silver on the edges of the iron halo. The details around the skull. And the points here, trying to avoid the areas where the points attach to the halo part. Okay. So she was actually starting to come a little bit loose on the top of that thing there, and I'm not quite done working on her before gluing her on there. So just going to kind of reapply just a touch of super glue here. Tend to work on stages, attach things to toothpicks that are attached to a base. That way I can kind of work on them without them being attached to the other part. We were really mentioning how much she moves around on this thing. I wouldn't want to paint all that together like that. So the last thing that I'm going to do on this part here before attaching her, because I don't want to have the rest of her body get in the way of us working on these scrolls, is do a quick dry brush of that area there of the purity seals hanging down in Screaming Skull. Really work it into the paper towel here. And now we're just gonna stick to the edges. It's gonna move around a lot on us. That's okay, because with these things we're really just trying to give it a nice clean highlight. I want these to be a little bit dingier and messier on the dry brush. Just preference. With this type of thing, really just take your time. Going over it a couple times with the same brush will let your dry brush really pick out those highlights. And there's some areas that really look good and lend to being just left alone. But mostly focus on the areas where your shade has pulled up, and the more you go over those areas, the more it'll blend it together. So the dry brush has created these areas here where you can see these harder lines, and that's where, you know, more of our creases are in that. So now that I'm done with that, I'm going to take the same color in that Screaming Skull with a regular brush off of my palette. We're going to do edge highlights of this, mostly where it's raised up. If you get a little too much on it, you can just kind of dab at it with your hand or a paper towel or what have you. Hit these really clean edges here. And go back over the areas where we saw those lines develop. From there. Again, not too worried about the surface of these things being too bright or being absolutely perfect. Fabric, it's not supposed to be. And although it just depends on what you're really going for. If you want it to be really clean, paint the whole thing one color and then hit it with a wash once. Thin the wash down so that it doesn't pull up too much on you and you have to go back over it again. If you want a little bit dingier, you can do this dry brush method and just call it a day. I like somewhere kind of in the middle where the dry brush establishes kind of a nice highlight, but at the same time I can go through and kind of pick things out. And then we're going to go back through with Rhinoxide and again our fine point brush like we used for the eyes and whatnot. Water it down so it doesn't dry up on you, because again this is a really fine point brush. They'll dry, if you don't get enough on there or enough water, it can dry between the palette and working on the model. So then we have this here, and we're just going to kind of create some little lines. Like I said, I like the technique that they used where they had some different symbols, so I'm going to leave some blank spaces in between these things and come back in with some red. See here, it doesn't need to be perfect. Just make it look like there's some writing on there. At some point you can come back in over with black a little bit if you want to darken it down just a little touch. But obviously, keep the water on there. It'll dry pretty thin. It'll blend in already with what you've already got there. It can get a little bit difficult where these really heavy creases come in. Sometimes I'll do that. Sometimes I'll just make little marks and move on. Just about done with these things here. We're just going through and working little lines, little marks. So you can go through, obviously using like some old books that I had for Sisters of Battle, some old Demon Hunter stuff. Check online, look up, some old symbols for Inquisition or Ordo Malleus. Kind of check out what type of icons and symbols that they used. Kind of that Inquisition eye is a popular one. The Sisters of Battle fleur-de-lis, or just some different red colors for some boxes and stuff, just to break up this lines. Really whatever you want to do with it. I like the idea of the different colors, so something to just kind of break up that area. So I'm going to grab some Mephiston red. This is an area here where you want to be really careful. Working into the white area at the same time as doing these parts here. So like we had here, just kind of make like a very, very light touch. And we can kind of create a line. They don't have to be perfect. But just different symbols here to kind of break things up a little bit. And then at the end of it, you can be a little bit more careful. And just kind of lightly create the Sisters logo. If you want, it doesn't. It's so small that any little touch of detail would stand out. So I'm doing my best to keep the paint really thin. Here, don't let the brush splay out too wide, because then you start getting really wide marks, and it doesn't really blend in very well with the thin little lines that you already put. One more should do it. But that's probably about enough. Okay. Last thing for this area here, and then we can actually attach Celestine to her lower half here. I want to put the line in for the line work on her cape, and then do the dry brush of the base before I have to put her on there and she's in the way. So I'm going to thin down the red that I was already working on for the lower areas there. So I want this to flow really easily onto that underside here, and then you may have to stop and start over in different areas here, but try to work with, kind of focus on keeping the distance between the line that you put here if you're going to do that freehand line between that and the cape. So right here, just working on being as smooth as possible. And this model likes to move a lot, so really just bracing it the best that I can, and focusing on keeping a really thin line and keeping the same distance between that line and the bottom edge of the cape as I can as we go along. There's little details and stuff that work off of this line, and we'll do those after we finish getting this line on the cape. So now that we have it there, it's turning really hard here, so I'm going to flip it over again and always make sure that I'm working from a space that I'm comfortable with keeping it very still. So if you notice, like right here, there was an area where I was connecting the two lines together, and it made like a little bit of a mark there. These type of really thin lines that you add, or if you're doing any of these freehands, it really stands out in areas that I mess up. So that's an area where you can see like there's kind of details and stuff that come off of that line on the source model. So I'll just use that detail or that mess up and just kind of to my advantage and bring it up as a line off of there. And just make it like a small arrow point. So try to take the mess up, use them to your advantage, and create another little small detail there if you were trying to just create a perfect line, and then just to keep it looking nice and crisp.
You still got it.
Some other freehand jobs I've done a bit easier than this one. Trying to put this almost perfect little line of red across the backside of a white cape. Gives you a nice big margin of error. Yeah, so I just felt that something like this would be really difficult to do while she's still attached to it. Last part here, and then we are done with this part of the model. Okay, so overall, pretty happy with the outcome of that. It's a really, really, really fine little line that just goes along the back edge of her cape. Kind of matches up with some of the similar colors that we or similar shapes and forms that we see across different Sisters of Battle pieces. It's really helped connect her with the other armies. Kind of gotta put a little bit of Carolwood Crimson there on my purity seal. That's done. Switch to some Agarax Earthshade to the seal itself that holds the birds onto there. Let that pull up. Doing my best to avoid the birds. And then lastly, I'm going to come back through here, use a little bit of Ulthuan Grey on the crummiest. Oh yeah, someone's mentioning the connection to the base. Yeah, very fiddly. Definitely concerned with how strong. Thank you. Definitely concerned with how strong of a connection it is there. I may end up redoing the base and maybe like a small statue or a piece of rubble or something like that and attach it to her foot to kind of stabilize and get an extra point instead of just these two pieces and the rest of her really moving around like that. But I did like her floating on those from a design standpoint. get the dry brush done for the rocks on her base, or for the gravel and stuff. Gonna be really light and really careful here. Mostly focused on the edges of it.
Trader Marines are allowed to use that block if they see templates and aren't approved. But that's what I'm saying.
Kind of focus on highlighting up the edges of the stone. Right like that. We'll do Mornfang brown. I'm not too worried about how messy this is. We'll clean up the edge of the base all the way to the edge of the stone, and that'll break up the bottom. So actually, I'm just going to go ahead and take Celestine that we've been working on here for a little while and pop her off this base that I put on her leg. There was a blank spot back there, so even if I got a little bit of glue in there, I don't think it really would affect connecting her to the base, because nothing connects to that point. It's just a blank spot. And then we're her into this big cape that we just worked on. So obviously you can't use plastic glue here for this one, but because it's already painted. But some super glue, some standard. Use Gorilla Glue. It holds painted areas together pretty well. Just give it a second. And there we go. We have her finally attached to her cape. But yeah, you add in the wings, and you've got a huge model really attached to these tiny little points. And every time that you move her around or play a game with her, she's rocking around like crazy. So I'm not sure if I'm wild about this, but I like what it does for the model, design-wise. So now that we have that, I want to do a little bit of details here. I got about 15 minutes left on the stream. I'm going to come back in and do white, and then I want to do the thunder kind of effect, or the lightning effect that we have on her blade. And then after we're done, looking at the time that we have left on the stream, I'm not going to be doing a third stream for her. I'll probably just clean up the edges on top of her hair, put some highlights on there, clean up her face a little bit. You probably wouldn't even notice it within the stream here with the type of cameras, but get a better picture and put it in the post, just so you can see what this looks like when she's all finished up. So what I want to do is grab some Ulthuan Gray. It does a really nice job of almost being like white paint, like ceramite white, except unless it's just me, ceramite tends to cover like crap. It likes to really lump up on me. For a while I was using P3 paints. They do like a pure pigment type of paint that covers really well. Haven't been able to find it for a while, and Ulthuan Gray, when you put it on there, it's so close to white that you can barely tell the difference. So I just do that pretty much. Really the difference here, you can see that's pure white on her cloak, Ulthuan Gray on the birds. It's really negligible. So I want to do white on the areas on her knees. I want to do white on the floor on her shoulder and the wings on her other shoulder. So I'm just going to go ahead and work that right in right here. What we did previously is put down Reichland flesh shade on these areas to cover up the gold. Trying to do this white directly over gold probably wouldn't work out too well. You wouldn't get a good amount of coverage, and you'd still see a little bit of metal through the white highlight. So this, just being really careful. Paint towards the edges of this and let it kind of pull up on the edge of that, and it'll already create a highlight for you because we have the flesh shade from behind. Going through her other knee here. Say if thanks, Ben. Say that you know, if it's your goal to paint a model where you're working with pretty much the smallest brush that you have the whole time, this one will definitely scratch that itch. You know, she has a pretty big board presence in the game. And the old model was pretty big. It was a big heavy metal model with big heavy wings and stuff like that. They've redone her now. I don't know what this is, like a year and a half, 2 years ago maybe, that this came out, a year ago. And the new design, I love what they've done with this. The design that they put onto the Gemini that are with her. If they carry that design to the new army, I think that's going to look fantastic when that's all said and done. But you know, if you're used to at this point painting big tanks and Primaris Marines and all that stuff with really big details, this one, she is tiny. Someone asking, been asking what kind of brush they are. This one here is it's backwards on there. It's a Winsor & Newton Series 7. They're actually watercolor brushes. Any kind of red sable brush that you can use. I really like these. Go through, paint pretty much weekly, almost every night. And I'll go through maybe 2 of these brushes a year. If you take good care of them, they hold an amazing point. This is a 0 to work on this really small stuff. The other stuff is I have a couple size 1s right here. 0, 1. And you can fan them out, and if you don't pull the brush point to a tip, you can do bigger areas with them. But if you work that thing down to a tip, you can pretty much do one model without really tiny details with one brush, just depending on how much you really twist the tip of the brush and get it to a nice fine point. It holds that point, which is the nicest part about it, so that if you're trying to work on an area and you say, okay, I'm going to work on her shoulder right here, and I want this brush to hold this tiny little fine tip so that I can work through each of these same size details as I go across her wing. You want a brush that's going to keep that tip the whole time. And I've had mixed luck with the Citadel brushes. I really like Citadel brushes for the dry brush is something you can really get messed up. The wash brushes are nice. And some of their smaller detail brushes, but when I go to this type of detail, tend to use these sable brushes, mostly for watercolor, or that's what they're intended for, but they do really, really well on this type of detail. So you can see what I mean by keeping a consistent brush tip. When you look at her shoulder there, and we've done highlights on all the feathers on that eagle part, and each stroke that you put down is the same size. So as you work through that, you get less and less paint on your brush, and it's starting to dry a little bit. Some brushes really like to fray and splay out on you, and you start kind of getting some unintended results. So when you get something that you're confident is going to stay together like that, you can really work through some of these models pretty quickly. You don't have to worry about every little brush stroke. You can just confidently put down paint. So now that we have the Ulthuan Gray put down, I'm going to grab one more little bit of that on a bigger brush, on a wash brush. Actually, the new GW wash brushes, the Citadel ones, hold pretty pointy. I got someone asking if I find the synthetic brushes start to curl at the tip faster than natural. Absolutely. These, like I said, this, let me see here. This is a natural brush right here. It's probably got it last summer, I'm thinking. If I look at this one, it's kind of messed up. I've had it for a long time, and it's still holding a good point. This is a dry brush that I just bought, and it's starting to curl up on me in synthetic. What I usually do for those, if you have synthetic brushes that curl up on you, there's this like a brush cleaner. It's like a puck. I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment. It's almost like a soap cleaner. You can put that stuff on there and let it dry, and then put something heavy between it. Put it between a couple of sheets of paper towel. Twist the brush tip, set something heavy on it, and press the bristles back. So I have this one that curled up on me. Did the same thing. Yes, Master Brush Cleaner. That stuff is awesome. If you have brushes, I've had ones that I thought, otherwise to just throw away, that they were done, but maybe give it one more chance. Let it sit in some simple green overnight, and then go back over with some Master Brush Cleaner, let it dry on the brush for like 20-30 minutes, wash it off, keep continuing to twist the brush tip and put some weight on it, and then do it again. Hey, I couldn't speak to how Master Brush Cleaner tastes, but it adds a little character. Alright, so the flowers on her sword, I don't want to have to try to paint individually. So paint the whole thing white. We're going to go over it in Carroburg Crimson to bring that down, and then maybe just take something a little bit more kind of pinkish, like pink horror, and go back over the upper edges of the petals and kind of shade that nicely. Left this alone. I want to get a little bit of a shade on the red on the center part of her there, and on that just kind of a simple highlight there. So I'm going to take a small brush again because it's another really tiny area. Grab some Mephiston red. This is already corn red right here that had some Null oil over it, and then just the raised edges, just kind of work that area in there, provide a little bit of a highlight. If you look really close, there's kind of these like rivets or studs or something that stick up. I'll paint those in silver just to kind of give them that metal look. But they've been so kind to make this actually contour to her body in here and have folds because it's leather or fabric or something. And just kind of want to go over it just a little bit just to give kind of a highlight. We're going to do the same thing to the areas down here. On the lower part of her tabard, and then switch over to Wild Rider Red, which is actually more of a orangey color. You wanted really less is more of this type of stuff, and work an edge highlight into there of this. not barely putting any down, but creates a nice highlight. On the edges of her tabard. Alright, so last thing here is that this isn't quite as white as I would want it to be up on her shoulder, so I am going to go back over with ceramite white. It does get thick, so I'm going to try to water it down just a touch. Be sure to really clean your brush good. Sorry for the noise, I have a spring inside this jar that kind of gets paint off your brush a little quicker. But if you're already painting red, and use the same brush to go to white, if you don't get it perfect, it's going to turn pink like that just did. Alright, so really thin down ceramite white, going right back over this one, taking the edges of these wings and just kind of pushing paint onto the edges there. See, I kind of hit the edges of her armor there. White on that, it's not too noticeable. If you really want to be a perfectionist, go back and fix it. I have to go back over some areas with Stormhull Silver, so I'm not too worried about that. Here. And really that's created a pretty decently shaded white emblem there. There's a jewel on her shoulder, which I'm just going to do a two-part shade to. We're going to make it pretty quick. In red. Start with corn red. With the edges of the gem. There's a little rim around it that we're going to do in gold. Don't worry about being super clean with this because we can come back through. Again, it's a really tiny fine area. But we'll use gold Retributor armor to go around the rim of that gem. I apologize if it's a little bit hard to see. It's a very small detail here on her shoulder. So again, I got a little bit of gold on the edge of the gem. If you're trying to be nice and perfect with it, you can kind of go back and forth between the red and the gold until you get to a point where you like it. And then now that I have those, I already have some Wild Rider left on my palette. I'm going to use that to paint the edge of this gem, kind of the upper part here, so it creates a little bit of a highlight. And then I'm going to grab just a touch of Oathworn Gray. And put one single little dot on top, right there. Really tiny, really fine, but it creates that reflection on the gem in the middle of the wing. It just makes it look nice. So, another fine point here where if I'm not wild about the gold around the rim of the gem where it meets the white details there. So if I put a wash on there, it's likely going to fill in the areas of the wing. And that's not what I want after doing all the white details on that one. So I'm going to come back over through here with some thinned down Rhinox hide. About as thin, almost too thin for regular coverage. You want to kind of get it watery. And then just paint it right into the crease between the wings and that gem. And you'll create a shadow there that separates that gem out between that and the wings. Really subtle. If you didn't do it, you'd probably be the only person that didn't notice it, or that notices it, but I like how it makes that gem between the wings really pop out. As long as I have this color out, this really thinned down Rhinox hide, there are other areas around the model that I kind of want to go and fix up. It's not too noticeable when you put this stuff in the creases between things, so if you look at like here on her hand, the skin tone is pretty close to that gold tone, and I'm going to take that and just go right in between her hand and that armor right there to put a line in and kind of just create like a little bit of a contrast between colors that are a little bit too close together. You could do the same thing for fingers, and this is just something where if you have some extra time, or if you feel like you do, to go back through with the smallest brush that you have and create those lines. So I did it over here on her other hand. You can probably see right in there that now that separated her fingers out. Smallest little detail, but for this type of thing I really want to give it my best shot to make it look as nice as I can. Alright, so I'm going to grab a little bit of the Stormhost Silver off my palette. And the areas that I got on her cowl with all this skin tone, I'm going to come back in silver and kind of give it that armored, that shiny edge back. I'm going to do the same thing to the detail here on this little strap. I'm going to pick out the edges of the hilt of her sword. And just kind of define that edge there to let that kind of pop out. And where these hoses attach, put a little bit of a highlight line there. And then those areas of those kind of studs on her armor, again with the smallest brush that I've had, been using this one a lot for this model. Maybe the next one that we do, we'll have some bigger areas to work on. So, as long as we got a few people watching, might as well do a small poll. Next model that I work on, I'm trying to decide whether I should do something from 40K again, Age of Sigmar. Sigmar sounds kind of fun just because there's lots of models with lots of natural things to paint. Skin, fabric, you know, some grungier armor or monsters, whatnot, whereas 40K, you know, you're looking more just into painting armor, which is why I didn't choose like a tank or something like that, because who wants to watch armor getting painted for 2 hours? Sounds boring to me. Come back in with silver at the base of her midsection here, just to kind of create a little bit of a highlight and differentiate between the two. She's coming out pretty nice so far. I want to do a little bit more detail on her face, just to bring the quality of highlights and everything of her face up to how the armor came out. And a little bit more work on her sword, whether to do a power sword and really give it that kind of glow effect. For now, grab some Stormhost Silver. I'm just going to highlight kind of the raised parts of her blade. And sort of dry brush it in there. Same goes for the hilt and the pommel. Right there. Alright. So now that the flowers have gotten a pretty good amount of time to dry, with that white, we didn't want that to be even a little bit wet, because we're coming back through with a pretty thick coat of Carroburg Crimson on those flowers. And if that was even slightly wet, it would just pick that up, turn kind of pinkish, and then get really muddy on us. So I want to do 2 quick coats to this. So I'm going to mute really quick, grab a hair dryer, dry it off, and do another coat, and then go back over the upper edges of it, but I don't want to wait for it. So I'm just going to mute for 1 second. Okay, so overall I'm pretty happy with how this dried. I'm actually just going to use a little bit of the white that I have on here and do a little bit of a detail on the upper edges of the petals to just kind of pick those out. Again, it's kind of an organic form, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Just to pick it here and there and see, kind of how would light naturally hit those. So I'm pretty happy with that for the flowers that are coming off of her. Okay, so last few things here, and then can pretty much call her done. I want to grab some Eshin Gray, do the details in her hair. Highlight the edges of these where they come down. Around her face. And then they always give you some detail on the backside too. Don't neglect that. And then an area here where it comes across the top of her head. Now, with this, if you start with Eshin Gray and then go straight up to something really, really bright like Dawnstone or whatnot, it's going to almost look kind of plasticky, especially that one. So you want to keep the difference between the layers that you do for her hair really close. So going over to Mechanica Standard and just working closer to the tips of her hair here. then lastly, I'm going to end with Dawnstone. I'm just picking out a couple raised points here and there where the light might hit black hair. Close to the edges, not all the way at the tip, maybe about halfway on some of these locks of hair. And then up top. Keeping the highlights really thin. And then if you find that you're gonna get messy, or if you hit an area where you didn't want, just come back through later with black paint and fix it up. Overall, pretty happy with that. Okay, so just using the GW shade brush that I have, the newer one. It's pretty thick, it holds a pretty good point. Going back around to the bottom and doing the edge of her base. In this one, again, it depends what color, you know, just kind of matching her to the rest of your army. For some reason, I tend to just do it in this color, kind of just an earthy color usually, regardless of the rest of the base or the rest of the I don't like black because goblin green. Yeah, they used to do, I remember all the old school fantasy, they did bright goblin green edges to the bases. That was pretty, I don't know, not my thing. But sometimes Chaos Black looks nice on the edge of the base. Sometimes I feel like it looks like the base wasn't painted just because it's the same color as when it was. I'm painting from Immortals Inc. Comic shop in Rocky River. It's near, there's like a big shopping center close to Fairview Park. Office building in the lower level. Really nice shop, nice owners. I'm sure at the top of the stream post you can see their address. Coming back around here, because it was painted white originally, and there were some areas where, you know, the wash, like the non-oil wash that I put on the base, kind of came down and it was a little bit intermittent. If you go back through and look at it, you'll see areas where it's not perfect, or it didn't cover all the way. Warnfang has pretty good coverage. Tend to want to pick. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, pretty close. Tend to want to pick a color that has really good coverage for these ones. If you're going for a gray around your base, I've used ones like Skaven Blight Dinge. If you're familiar, that's got really nice coverage. It's kind of a greener, warmer gray. I think that looks really nice on some darker models, or I'm using that color on all of my Legions and the Gash models. And I think it's just a chance that I happen to use this color on like a lot of other stuff. But there's that. I'll go back through later on, add some bigger rocks and textures, and glue in some static grass or some big flock pieces. And lastly, gonna grab a hold of these wings, slap some glue on this tiny little point right here. Right on. Carefully fish that onto her back. There's a few little details left here and there. I gotta add the lightning effect on her sword. That's gonna take a lot longer than the time left that I have on the stream. What's up? And I want to do some details here. You know what? This won't take long. The sword will take some time. Just to, start with Cantor blue, add kind of a background Baharoff blue for that really light color, up into a white, and kind of paint in areas where the lightning effect would really pop out on her sword. It's very time consuming. It takes some good practice. Maybe we can work on another model sometime in the future, but just don't have time for it today. So I want to do this red cable where the iron halo is attached to her backpack. If you can see it, this is literally the only point that this thing is attached to the back, so that's also really fragile. There's also a little tiny Inquisition symbol on the forehead of the skull. I've seen those filled in red quite often, so I'm going to do that again. Reinforcing the idea of these sable brushes. Number one just did that tiny little detail there. You keep them good, they have a good tip to them, and it'll keep that. We did all the detail on hers. There's a 40K match going on next to me on the other side of this wall. So, alright. So, I have a little bit of detail left in her face. I want to kind of establish that lower lip a little bit more and kind of lighten up a little bit of the skin tone. Right now there's a lot of white between her eyes and her cheek, that you're trying to do this glow effect to her eyes, and I want that to be a little bit more subtle. Right now it's like stark white eye, really white around the cheeks, and it doesn't look like her eyes are really glowing. It's just more white on her face. So I'll go back in with some skin tone and work that into her cheeks towards her eye, but leaving the parts towards her eye alone, and then maybe grabbing a little bit of a blue glaze or a really watered down blue paint, maybe Baharoff, and paint that into the cracks. It's super tiny, super tedious. It's something where you're pretty much like face into the model trying to get that done. So have that, the static effect, maybe a little bit more of a using some of that Rhinox hide watered down to go around areas, which I'll do an example here really quick because it's fast, but water it down, and then I have areas here where like the detail here between the white of the flirt and her gold armor, it's a little too close, and I want to create a contrast there to show that it's actually a different part. And you can take that Rhinox hide and the very, 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 very fine tip of your brush and work that in around the edges and kind of do like a concentrated wash. So you already see it kind of picks out that edge there, and it looks pretty nice. Same goes for any of the detail of her cords, where you don't want to have to try to, or washing it multiple times may impact what you've already painted, and you can use that to just pick out tiny little cracks in the model. Thank you. Other than that, she's about done. Gonna paint up the two Gemini to about the same quality as her. Obviously, if she's running around with them, they won't all look the same. But so theirs are, say, 90% done. Celestine, sword, face, and that's about it. There's the back side of all of her wings, the cloak that really wanted to get a nice shade going down into the recesses, and there she is. She is so fragile. It's going to be great, you know, every time you move her on the board to just, and may end up coming back in with a piece, you know, like this on the base, maybe a pillar or a light pole or something, and bracing it to her foot so she doesn't rock around as much on these two things. But like we were saying earlier, I like the idea of her floating on there on her wings. So, all right. So thanks for taking some time and watching me paint this model. It's been a blast. I'll probably look into doing, like I said, Armored Helverin next, something out of the Imperial Nightline, or dipping over into Age of Sigmar, have some Iden at Deepkin, plenty of Stormcast to paint, have some Sylvaneth to work on, and maybe the different ones. With the Hobbit stuff coming up, I've been getting into to that with the new release, and have Mirkwood and Thranduil's halls, and I actually have a Thranduil model to paint up. I saw that suggestion pop up. So I have him on his horse to paint up too. And you think this was small. The scale for the Hobbit or Middle Earth now they call it is even smaller, and those are just like, you know, hey, do you want a base coat with the smallest brush you have? Well, here you go. They're very tiny, but in the end you can get some really, really cool effects with those as well. So alright, so I'm going to finish her up probably tonight, and then in the comment section here I'll post a photo of in like a light box and stuff of her all finished up with all the details added that we just discussed. So until next time, thanks everyone, and have a good one.